They say some places are abandoned. They're wrong. Sometimes, they're simply waiting for someone broken enough to understand them. What would make a 25-year-old woman with nowhere left to go spend her last $289 on a forgotten ferry station everyone believed was cursed? No electricity, no neighbors, no future, just a broken dock, a lonely boathouse, and one desperate hope. Maybe broken places understand broken people, because by 25, Madeline Brooks had already lost almost everything. Her father died when she was 14. The last thing he ever told her was, "Promise me you'll find somewhere you belong." She promised, but 11 years later, she still hadn't. Her mother moved away. She dropped out of college one semester before graduating, worked nights at diners, cleaned motel rooms, took whatever job she could find. Still, life kept taking. The company she worked for shut down. Her apartment was repossessed, and one freezing November morning, Madeline woke up in the back seat of her car. She counted her savings 3 times. $289. That was all. No family, no home, no one waiting for her. That night, wrapped in an old blanket, she searched online for somewhere anywhere she could afford. Then she saw it. For sale, Blackwater Ferry Station. Built in 1925. Abandoned for nearly a century. Price, $289. The photos were heartbreaking. The dock leaned into dark water. The boathouse windows were shattered. Wild vines covered the walls. Everything looked lonely, forgotten, just like her. Then she noticed one last photograph. A young woman stood alone at the end of the dock. Long coat, wind in her hair. The picture was dated October 1927. On the back, someone had written, "She waited her whole life." No name, no explanation. But Madeline couldn't stop staring at her eyes. They looked sad. The kind of sad that stays with you. At the bottom of the listing was a faded, handwritten note. Some places aren't abandoned. They're simply waiting for the right person to stay. Madeline read it again, and suddenly, she was crying, because no one had ever asked her to stay. Not after her father died. Not after her mother left. Not after she lost everything. Yet somehow, this broken ferry station felt like it was whispering, "Come home." 3 days later, she bought it, without seeing it. Using every last dollar she had, Madeline thought she was buying an abandoned ferry station. She wasn't. She was buying a second chance, because hidden beneath that lonely boathouse, buried under a century of silence, was the story of another young woman who once believed she was too broken to be loved, and somehow that story had been waiting for Madeline all along. The ferry station didn't welcome her. It groaned. It shivered. It stood against the crashing waves like an old man too stubborn to die. As Madeline stepped out of her car, icy wind whipped across the shoreline and cut through her coat. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before her, gray and restless beneath a sky heavy with clouds. For a moment, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The dock leaned dangerously to one side. The ferry terminal was little more than a skeleton of weathered wood and rusted iron. And the boathouse didn't feel haunted. It felt lonely, like a place that had loved deeply and never quite recovered. Yet somehow, it still stood, just like her. Madeline carried her 2 suitcases inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. Dust floated through beams of pale afternoon light. The smell of seawater mixed with old wood and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Loneliness, maybe. She laughed softly at herself. "Well, Maddie," she whispered, "you wanted somewhere to belong." The sound of her voice echoed back at her. No answer. Only silence. That first night was brutal. The power hadn't worked in years. There was no heat. No running water. Madeline slept wrapped in 3 blankets inside the old office beside the dock. The wind howled all night. The building groaned. Waves slammed against the pilings below. At one point, she almost got back in her car. Almost drove away. But where would she go? So she stayed. The next morning, she began exploring. The ferry station was larger than she'd expected. An old ticket office, a waiting room filled with broken benches, storage closets stuffed with fishing nets and rusted tools, and the boathouse. She saved that for last. Something about it unsettled her. It sat a little apart from everything else, close to the water, as if keeping secrets from the rest of the world. The padlock on the door had rusted shut decades ago. Madeline found an old hammer and hit it until it broke apart. The door groaned open. Cold air rushed out. She stepped inside. The room was smaller than she'd imagined. An overturned rowboat rested in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling. And, in the center of the room, a rocking chair. Madeline stopped. The chair faced the sea. Its wood was worn smooth, as if someone had spent years sitting there, watching the waves, waiting for someone who never came home. Madeline swallowed. Suddenly, the room didn't feel frightening. It felt heartbreakingly sad. She was about to leave when something caught her eye. Behind the rocking chair hung an old photograph. The glass was cracked, but the image inside was clear. A young woman. Long coat, wind in her hair. Standing at the end of the dock. Madeline's heart skipped. It was her. The girl from the listing. She took the picture down. On the back was written, Margaret Hale, 1904 to 1927. And beneath it, some people disappear. Others become part of a place forever. Madeline stared at the words. 1927. The same year as the photograph. What happened to her? Why did she disappear? And why did someone leave her portrait here? A strange sadness settled over her. She set the picture carefully on a shelf. Then she noticed something else. The rocking chair. One of its legs rested on a loose floorboard. Madeline knelt. She pushed the chair aside. The wood beneath looked newer than the rest. She tapped it. Hollow. Her heartbeat quickened. "No way," she whispered. She found an old crowbar outside. Pried carefully. The board resisted. Then it lifted. Beneath it was a narrow compartment. And inside, a small brass key. Cold, heavy, beautifully carved. Attached to it was a faded leather tag. The handwriting was delicate, almost elegant. It read, Boathouse lower level. Madeline frowned. Lower level. She looked around. The boathouse wasn't big enough for a basement. At least, she didn't think it was. Suddenly she remembered something. When she'd first arrived, she'd noticed an old metal hatch near the back wall, half hidden beneath fishing nets. She'd assumed it led nowhere. Now she wasn't so sure. Madeline grabbed her flashlight, her pulse pounding in her ears. She crossed the room, pulled away the nets, and there it was, an iron hatch, covered in rust, locked. She knelt, inserted the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, click, The sound echoed softly through the room. Madeline held her breath. Slowly, she lifted the hatch. Cold air rushed upward, air that smelled of salt, old wood, and stories long forgotten. Below her, a narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. Madeline stared. Every instinct told her to close the hatch, walk away, pretend she'd never found it. Instead, she whispered the words her father used to tell her. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Maddie. It's choosing to move anyway. Tears filled her eyes. She smiled. Okay, Dad. Then she tightened her grip on the flashlight, placed one foot on the first step, and began to descend, not knowing that hidden beneath the old boathouse, waiting silently for nearly 100 years, was the story of a young woman who would change her life forever. Madeline almost turned back. The staircase beneath the boathouse was narrow and steep, its wooden steps worn smooth by feet that hadn't touched them in decades. Or so she thought. Her flashlight trembled slightly in her hand as she descended. One step, then another. The air grew colder. Not frightening, just quiet. The kind of quiet you find in old churches or empty homes. Places where life once happened. Places that still remember. Finally, her feet touched solid ground. Madeline swept the flashlight across the room and stopped. It wasn't a basement. It was a bedroom. A small iron bed stood neatly against the wall. A wooden desk faced a tiny window carved into the stone, where the ocean shimmered faintly in the distance. Books lined handmade shelves. An old wool coat hung beside the door. And on the desk, fresh lavender. Madeline frowned. That wasn't possible. The flowers were dry and brittle, preserved by time. Yet they still carried the faintest scent. The same scent she'd noticed halfway down the stairs. Suddenly, the room didn't feel abandoned. It felt cherished, like someone had loved this place too much to ever leave it behind. Madeline stepped closer to the desk. There, beside a brass oil lamp, rested a leather journal. Dark blue, its edges worn soft, embossed on the cover. Margaret Hale. Madeline's breath caught. She sat carefully in the chair and opened it. The first page read, April 6th, 1925. Father says grief is like the ocean. You think you've outrun it. Then one day it rises up and pulls you under again. I miss Daniel today. I miss him every day. Madeline swallowed. Daniel, the man Margaret loved, the man who never came home. She turned another page. May 11th, 1925. Everyone keeps telling me to leave Blackwater. They say this place is too sad. But where do lonely people go? And if I leave, who will remember him? Madeline stared at the words. Who will remember him? The question hit her harder than she expected. After her father died, she had worried about the same thing. That one day, she'd be the only person left who remembered his laugh, the way he whistled while making breakfast, the smell of sawdust on his jacket, and when she was gone, would he disappear too? A lump rose in her throat. She kept reading, page after page. Margaret wrote beautifully, not like someone recording events, like someone trying to save memories. She wrote about storms, about fishermen, about feeding stray cats near the dock, about missing Daniel every single day. And yet, the sadness never swallowed her. Instead, she kept loving. It kept helping people. It kept staying. Then, Madeline found an entry that made her stop breathing. October 19th, 1926. Today I almost left. I packed my bags, walked all the way to the station. But when I looked back, the ferry looked lonely. And suddenly I realized, so was I. Maybe that's why I stay, because broken places deserve love too. Madeline closed her eyes. The words settled somewhere deep inside her. Broken places deserve love too. Wasn't that exactly why she'd bought Blackwater? Not because it was smart, not because it was safe, but because, for the first time in years, she saw something as lonely as herself, and she couldn't bear to abandon it. Tears blurred her vision. She laughed softly and wiped them away. "You're unbelievable, Margaret," she whispered. "How do you understand me this much?" The room remained silent, but somehow it didn't feel empty anymore. Madeline continued reading. The journal entries became shorter, more secretive. Margaret began sketching maps. The shoreline, the boathouse, the cliffs, then strange symbols, arrows pointing beneath the water, notes written in the margins. "Not yet. I need to be certain. No one can know." Madeline frowned. "Know what?" She flipped forward. Several pages had been torn out. 1, 5, 10, nearly an entire section missing. Only jagged edges remained. Her pulse quickened. Why would someone remove them? And what had Margaret discovered? Near the end of the journal, only a few pages remained. The handwriting had changed. Not weaker, more certain, more peaceful. September 3rd, 1927. I've spent years believing I stayed because of grief. I was wrong. I stayed because this place gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. Madeline stared at the page, then looked around the room. At the little bed, the books, the lavender, the ocean outside. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater, she didn't feel like a failure. She didn't feel homeless or forgotten. She felt understood by a woman who had lived 100 years before her, a woman she'd never met, and somehow needed. Madeline turned to the final page. Only one sentence remained, written carefully, almost lovingly. "If you're reading this, it means you stayed. Nothing else. No explanation. No goodbye." Madeline frowned. That couldn't be the end. She lifted the journal, and something slipped from between the pages. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It wasn't a letter. It was a map. Hand-drawn. Detailed. The ferry station, the dock, the boathouse, and beneath the boathouse, a second chamber, one she hadn't seen. Beside it, Margaret had written only 4 words. "The truth sleeps here." Madeline stared at the map, then slowly looked around the hidden room. Suddenly, the mystery wasn't about Margaret anymore. It was about why she stayed, what she found, and why. She had waited 100 years for someone else to continue her story. Madeline didn't sleep that night. She tried. She lay beneath 3 blankets in the tiny office beside the dock, listening to the waves crash against the wooden pilings below. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Margaret's words. Broken places deserve love too. And somehow, those words hurt, because for years, Madeline had believed the opposite. She believed broken things were meant to be replaced, forgotten, left behind, people included. Hadn't everyone done exactly that to her? Her father died. Her mother left. Friends moved on. Jobs disappeared. Even the apartment she'd loved had new tenants now. Every place she'd ever called home eventually stopped needing her, so she'd stopped needing places. Or at least, she pretended to, until Blackwater, until Margaret, until that little room beneath the boathouse where a young woman had poured her heart onto paper a century ago. At sunrise, Madeline wrapped herself in her coat and walked to the end of the dock. The sea was calm, gentle. The horizon glowed pink and gold. She stood there for a long time, thinking about Margaret, about Daniel, about grief, about staying. And suddenly, she understood something she hadn't before. Margaret hadn't stayed because she was trapped. She stayed because she loved, even after losing everything. Maybe that was courage. Not moving on, but choosing to love again. Madeline smiled sadly. She wasn't there yet, but for the first time, she wanted to be. The days that followed felt different. The ferry station was still falling apart. The roof still leaked. The dock still groaned. The boathouse still smelled of salt and old wood. But Madeline stopped seeing damage. She started seeing possibilities. The waiting room could become a library. The old office. A little cafe. The boathouse. She wasn't sure yet. It felt wrong to change it too much. That room below belonged to Margaret somehow. A sacred place. So instead, Madeline cleaned. Carefully, respectfully. She dusted the books, folded Margaret's blanket, placed fresh lavender in a vase beside the bed. She even framed the photograph she'd found, the one of Margaret standing at the end of the dock. Young, beautiful, a little sad. Madeline placed it on the desk, then laughed quietly. "You're officially my roommate now." The room answered with silence, but not lonely silence, comfortable silence, the kind you share with someone who understands you. A week later, something unexpected happened. Madeline met her first neighbor. His name was Walter. 73, retired fisherman. Gruff voice, permanent scowl. He showed up carrying a toolbox. Didn't smile. Didn't introduce himself. Just stared at the broken dock and said, "You fixed those boards wrong." Madeline frowned. "Good morning to you too." Walter snorted, then spent 4 hours teaching her how to repair the dock properly. At sunset, he sat beside her on the steps, quietly chewing peppermint candy. Finally, he nodded toward the boathouse. "You been down there?" Madeline looked at him sharply. "You know about it." Walter stared out at the sea. Everybody in Blackwater knew about Margaret Hale. Nobody talked about her. Walter sighed, because some stories hurt too much. Then he stood and left, just like that, leaving Madeline with even more questions. That night, she returned to Margaret's journal. For hours she read, not searching for secrets, just reading. Margaret wrote about simple things. The smell of rain, fresh bread, sunsets over the harbor, children laughing near the dock. And slowly, Madeline realized something. Margaret wasn't extraordinary because she discovered something hidden. She was extraordinary because, despite heartbreak, she never became bitter. She kept noticing beautiful things. Madeline closed the journal. Tears filled her eyes. She thought of herself. How long had it been since she'd noticed beauty? Really noticed it? Years. Maybe longer. Life had become survival. Wake up, work, pay bills, try not to fall apart. She'd forgotten how to hope, forgotten how to dream, forgotten the girl who once wanted to restore old buildings simply because she loved their stories. And suddenly, she missed that girl, missed herself. The next morning, Madeline did something ridiculous. She painted the front door yellow, bright, cheerful, completely out of place. Walter nearly had a heart attack. "That looks awful," he grumbled. Madeline laughed. I like it. And she meant it. For the first time in years, she did something simply because it made her happy. Then she planted flowers, hung curtains, scrubbed windows. She played old jazz records while sweeping, danced alone in the waiting room, burned pancakes, cried while making coffee, laughed at herself. Lived, really lived. One evening, exhausted from sanding old wood, Madeline sat at the end of the dock. The sky burned orange. Seagulls drifted overhead. The sea shimmered beneath the fading light. She thought about the girl she'd been, alone in her car, believing nobody would miss her, believing she belonged nowhere. She looked back at the ferry station, still broken, still unfinished, but alive somehow. And suddenly, she understood something Margaret had known all along. Home isn't the place that saves you. It's the place that gives you room. To save yourself, Madeline smiled through tears. Maybe she hadn't bought Blackwater to escape her old life. Maybe Blackwater had found her, at exactly the moment she needed it most. And for the first time since her father died, Madeline Brooks no longer felt abandoned. She felt like she was finally beginning. For 3 days, Madeline couldn't stop thinking about the map. Every night before bed, she unfolded the fragile piece of paper and traced the faded lines with her fingertips. The ferry station, the dock, the hidden room beneath the boathouse, and one final mark, drawn deep inside the cliff. Beside it, Margaret had written, "The truth sleeps here." Madeline had no idea what it meant, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Not while drinking coffee, not while repairing the dock with Walter, not even while watching the sun disappear behind the ocean. Something was waiting, something Margaret had protected for nearly 100 years. And somehow, Madeline felt she had been invited to find it. On the 4th morning, she returned to the hidden room beneath the boathouse. The journal sat quietly on the desk. Margaret's photograph leaned beside the vase of dried lavender. Madeline smiled at it. "Okay," she whispered. "What are you hiding from me?" The room, as always, remained silent. She unfolded the map again. This time, she noticed something she'd missed before. A small symbol, a circle, drawn on the stone wall behind Margaret's bed. Madeline stood immediately. Her heart began to race. She walked toward the wall, ran her fingers across the rough surface. Nothing. She tried again. Then, a tiny crack, barely visible. She pushed. The stone didn't move. She pushed harder. Still nothing. Frustrated, she stepped back, and that's when she noticed it. A loose brick near the floor, hidden beneath years of dust. She knelt, pulled it free. Inside was an iron ring, cold against her fingers. Madeline hesitated, then pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the wall shifted, stone grinding against stone, dust swirling into the air, and a narrow doorway appeared. Madeline simply stared. A hidden chamber, sealed for decades, maybe longer. Margaret had known about it all along, and she'd hidden it. Why? Madeline switched on her flashlight and stepped inside. The room was smaller than she'd imagined. No windows, no furniture, just stone walls polished smooth by time, and in the middle stood a large oak chest, dark, heavy, wrapped in rusted iron bands. Madeline froze. There it was, the answer, or maybe the beginning of one. She walked slowly toward it, her heartbeat echoing in the silence. On top of the chest sat a small wooden box, and beside it, a folded letter. addressed simply, "To whoever stayed." Madeline swallowed. She picked up the letter. The paper trembled in her hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you stayed longer than most. People always ask why I never left. The truth is, I almost did 100 times. After Daniel died, after the storms, after the loneliness became unbearable. But every time I packed my bags, I looked at Blackwater, and I saw myself broken, forgotten, still standing, and I couldn't abandon it, because I hoped someone someday wouldn't abandon me either." Madeline stopped reading. Her vision blurred, slowly. She sat on the floor. The words hit too close to home. Wasn't that exactly what she'd been afraid of? That everyone eventually leaves. That one day, there will be no one left who remembers you. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears. The kind that come when someone finally says the thing you've been carrying alone. Madeline wiped her eyes and kept reading. "If you found this room, please don't remember me for what I hid. Remember me for how I lived, for the people I loved, for the mornings I almost gave up, but stayed anyway, because courage isn't being fearless. It's choosing love, even after heartbreak." Madeline pressed the letter against her chest. The room suddenly felt impossibly small, not because of the walls, because of the love inside it. A love that had survived storms, survived grief, survived an entire century, and somehow reached her. A lonely 25-year-old girl who once believed she belonged nowhere. Madeline looked at the oak chest. It sat quietly in the center of the room. Locked? Waiting. She reached out, then stopped. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what might be inside. Gold, jewels, secrets. None of that seemed important anymore, because Margaret had already given her something priceless. Hope. The same hope Madeline thought she'd lost years ago. She smiled through tears. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "You don't have to tell me everything yet." The ocean roared faintly beyond the stone walls, as if answering. Madeline stood, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back on the chest. She wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. Some treasures deserve patience, and some mysteries change you long before they're solved. As she walked back toward the hidden doorway, Madeline looked over her shoulder one last time. The chest remained there, silent, waiting, just as it had for nearly 100 years. And somehow, Madeline knew. When the time finally came to open it, her life would never be the same again. Madeline never opened the chest. Not that day. Not the next. Not even after a week. To Walter, it made absolutely no sense. "You found a secret room and a locked chest," he grumbled, while hammering new boards onto the dock. "And you're just ignoring it." Madeline laughed. "I'm not ignoring it." "Then what are you doing?" She looked out at the ocean. The morning sun danced across the water. Seagulls drifted lazily overhead. For a moment, she thought about Margaret, about the letter, about the words she'd read over and over again. "Remember me for how I lived, not for what I hid." Madeline smiled. "I'm learning how to stay." Walter frowned, then shook his head. "You really are strange." Maybe she was. But for the first time in years, she liked the person she was becoming. The days slowly turned into months. A winter faded. Spring arrived. Wildflowers bloomed along the shoreline, and Blackwater began to change. So did Madeline. Every morning she woke before sunrise, made coffee, walked to the end of the dock, and watched the ocean wake up. She used to hate mornings. Now, they became her favorite part of the day, because they reminded her of something Margaret once wrote. Every sunrise is proof that the world hasn't given up on us yet. Madeline had copied those words onto a piece of paper. She taped it beside her bed. Some mornings, she still cried when she read them. She repaired the waiting room first, then the ticket office, then the broken windows facing the sea. Walter helped, though he complained constantly. Soon, others started showing up. A retired teacher brought books. A fisherman donated old photographs. The florist in town sent flowers every week. A teenage boy painted the front porch. Someone repaired the old piano. Another person brought curtains. Little by little, Blackwater stopped looking abandoned and started looking loved. One Saturday afternoon, Madeline opened the boathouse to visitors. Just a few neighbors at first. She showed them Margaret's room, the journal, the photograph, the lavender. People stood quietly. Some cried. Walter cried too, though he denied it. An elderly woman named Ruth touched Margaret's picture and whispered, "My grandmother used to talk about her." Madeline looked up. What did she say? Ruth smiled sadly. That Margaret made lonely people feel less lonely. Madeline felt tears sting her eyes, because somehow that was exactly what Margaret had done for her. 100 years later. At night, Madeline sat alone in the hidden room. The chest still waited in the center. Silent. Patient. She hadn't touched it. Not once. Instead, she came here to think, to read, to talk to Margaret, which probably sounded ridiculous. But somehow, it helped. She looked at the photograph on the desk. The young woman with sad eyes. 23 years old. Heartbroken, yet brave enough to stay. Madeline smiled softly. "You know something," she whispered. "I used to think I bought Blackwater to save it." She laughed. "I was wrong." The ocean echoed faintly beyond the stone walls. And suddenly, she understood. Blackwater never needed saving. Margaret never needed saving. They had survived. What needed saving was her, the girl sleeping in her car. The girl who thought being abandoned meant being unlovable. The girl who spent years surviving. Without truly living, tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness. Gratitude. Because somehow, this forgotten place had given her something no one else could. Permission. Permission to grieve. Permission to hope. Permission to begin again. One evening, Walter found her sitting at the end of the dock, watching the sunset. He lowered himself beside her with a groan. "You know," he said, "people are talking." Madeline smiled. "That's never good. They say you've brought Blackwater back to life." Madeline shook her head. "No." She looked toward the boathouse, the hidden room beneath it. Margaret, the letters, the life she'd left behind. "I think Blackwater brought me back to life." Walter looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "As someone who's lived here his whole life," he said quietly, "I think Margaret would be proud of you." Madeline looked away quickly, because suddenly she couldn't speak. That night she couldn't sleep. She walked to the hidden room once again. The chest sat exactly where it always had. Waiting. Madeline knelt beside it, ran her fingers gently across the old wood, and, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what might be inside. Not because she expected treasure, but because she had already found something far more valuable. A home, a purpose, a family she never expected, and herself, the version of herself she'd been searching for all these years. She smiled, then looked at Margaret's photograph. "You know," she whispered, "I think I'm finally keeping my promise." The promise she'd made her father, 11 years ago, to find somewhere she belonged. Madeline looked around the hidden room, at the old journals, the lavender, the ocean beyond the stone walls, and the chest, still locked, still waiting. A strange feeling washed over her. Not fear, not curiosity, something else. Peace. Because for the first time in her life, Madeline Brooks no longer needed a treasure to save her. She had already been saved. She just didn't know that the greatest surprise of all was still waiting inside that chest. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. Nothing special about the day. The sky was gray, the ocean restless. Walter had gone home early because his knees were hurting again. And Madeline, well, she was simply tired of waiting. For months, the chest had sat in the hidden room beneath the boathouse, silent, patient, almost as if it knew she wasn't ready. But things were different now. Madeline wasn't the frightened girl who had arrived in Blackwater with $289 and nowhere to go. She had friends, a home, a purpose. Most importantly, she had hope. And maybe that was exactly what Margaret had wanted. Madeline carried the old iron key she'd found tucked inside Margaret's final letter. She had discovered it only a few days earlier, hidden beneath a loose piece of paper, accompanied by just one sentence. Open it only when you no longer need what's inside. Madeline remembered crying when she read those words, because for the first time in her life, she truly didn't. She didn't need money to prove she mattered. She didn't need success, or approval, or rescue. Blackwater had already given her everything she thought she'd lost forever. So that morning, she took a deep breath and opened the chest. The lock resisted. Rust cracked. Metal groaned. Then finally, click, Madeline froze. For a moment, she simply stared, her hands trembling. Then slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked gold coins, velvet bags of silver, pearls, antique jewelry, old bonds tied with faded ribbons. The room glowed softly beneath her flashlight. It was a fortune, a real fortune. More money than Madeline had ever imagined. Yet strangely, she didn't cry. She smiled, a small, grateful smile. Then she whispered, "You kept your secret well." But beneath the gold, she noticed something else. A wooden box. Small, plain, almost hidden. Her heart skipped. Slowly. She lifted it out. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, tied together with blue ribbons faded by time. Madeline carefully opened the first one. "Dear Margaret, you saved my son during the storm of 1923. He's a grandfather now. Every birthday, he still tells your story. Another, Miss Hale, you brought food to my mother when no one else did. You never asked for thanks, but I've spent my whole life grateful. Another, Margaret, you once told me, broken hearts don't stay broken forever. I didn't believe you then. I do now." Madeline couldn't see any more. Tears filled her eyes, then spilled over, one after another, not because of the treasure, not because she was rich, but because Margaret had been remembered. All these years, people loved her. People carried her kindness with them. People told their children about her. And suddenly, Madeline realized something. Her greatest fear had never been poverty. It had never been failure. It was being forgotten, living an ordinary life, and disappearing without mattering to anyone. But Margaret changed that forever. You don't need fame. You don't need fortune. You just need to love people, and love them well. Madeline hugged the letters tightly against her chest and cried, not tears of sadness, tears of relief. Because if Margaret's kindness could survive a century, then maybe, just maybe, our small acts of love never really disappear. Months later, Blackwater changed forever. Madeline used part of the treasure legally recovered and documented to restore the ferry station. The waiting room became a library. Margaret's room remained untouched. Just as she left it, the hidden chamber became a small museum, and the letters, Madeline framed many of them. Visitors came from all over the country, not to see gold, not to see pearls, but to read Margaret's words, to remember, to heal. Some cried, some smiled, some sat quietly for hours, and every time Madeline saw that, she thought, this is the real treasure. 2 years later, Blackwater Ferry Station was officially recognized as a historic landmark. The town held a celebration. Children ran across the dock. Music drifted through the air. Walter pretended not to cry. He failed, spectacularly. As the sun began to set, Madeline walked alone to the end of the dock. The same place where Margaret stood in that old photograph. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, golden, peaceful. Madeline closed her eyes and thought about the girl she'd once been, sleeping in her car, broken, lonely, certain she belonged nowhere. She wished she could go back, just for a moment, to hug that girl and tell her, hold on, one day, you'll find your place. The wind blew softly. Madeline opened her eyes, back toward the ferry station, toward the people laughing, toward the home she'd built, and quietly, almost like a prayer, she whispered, thanks, Margaret. For a moment, the ocean seemed to answer, and Madeline smiled, because she finally understood something. Some places aren't abandoned. Some people aren't forgotten. And sometimes, the home you've been searching for your whole life has been waiting for you all along. There's a reason stories like this stay with us. It's not because of the hidden treasure, or the old ferry station, or the secrets buried beneath the boathouse. It's because most of us know what it feels like to be lost, to lose someone we love, to wonder if we'll ever feel whole again. Madeline knew that feeling. So did Margaret. They lived 100 years apart, yet somehow they carried the same fear, that maybe they didn't belong anywhere, but they were wrong, and maybe so are we. When Madeline was 14, she made a promise to her father. He held her hand and said, promise me you'll find somewhere you belong. For 11 years, she searched, in cities, in jobs, in people who didn't stay, until one day, with only $289 left, she bought a forgotten ferry station everyone else had abandoned. And in the end, she kept her promise, not because she found treasure, but because she finally understood something. Home isn't the place that saves you. It's the place that gives you room to save yourself. Maybe that's why this story found you, because you're not looking for gold. You're looking for hope, proof that it's not too late to heal, to begin again, to find your place in this world. And if a lonely 25-year-old girl who thought she'd lost everything, could find her way home. Maybe. There's still hope for all of us, because sometimes the place you rescue ends up rescuing you, and the greatest treasure you'll ever find isn't hidden in a chest. It's the person you become while searching